On a hot August morning in 1858, passers-by on South Main Street in Oberlin, Ohio, noticed several rough-looking men on the front porch of a hotel. Their cigar smoke hung in the air, and their voices carried over the street with a drawl unfamiliar in northeastern Ohio. They were slave catchers, come from Kentucky, looking for a runaway named John Price, who had been rumored to be taking shelter in Oberlin, a well-known stop on the Underground Railroad. They carried guns and handcuffs. They knew they were not in friendly territory.
Oberlin, Ohio, was a hotbed of abolitionism. Oberlin College, founded in the 1830s, was the first college to admit African American men and women. Absolutely radical ideas for the time. In 1858, Oberlin was the largest school in the state, with 1,200 students, including 32 who were black. And the community around the college included many persons, white and black, who felt the same way about slavery. They hated it. They hated the slaveholding interests that dominated national politics and therefore made criminals of abolitionists who helped slaves escape their cruel masters. In 1841, according to one Ohio newspaper, fanatical abolition anarchists from Oberlin hacked and sawed their way into a nearby jail and freed 2 runaway slaves. And in 1858 alone, 3 attempts had been made to seize black families from the community. Each had been foiled. These slave catchers from Kentucky knew they were in the belly of the beast. They took care to stay out of sight.
The slave catchers' leader was Anderson Jennings. Jennings was a farmer and slave owner. More importantly, he was the neighbor of a man named John Bacon in Kentucky. Jennings had been hired to get Bacon's runaway slave, John Price, back for him. He knew John on sight, had seen him many times back in Kentucky.
That boy John, tall boy, copper-colored, Bacon say he's no damn good. And when I catch him, I could sell him off. Get 500 or 1,000 for him, maybe.
He knew he needed help, and he had help from the United States government.
1858 was a good year to be in the slave trade. Slave catchers had federal law on their side. The 1850 Fugitive Slave Law made it a federal crime to help runaway slaves in any way. If found guilty, you could spend months in jail and pay thousands in fines. $1,000 could just about buy you a house in 1850.
Along with the Kentuckians, there was an Ohio lawman in the party, Deputy Marshal Jacob Lowe from Columbus, who was often involved in slave catching in the state, and who duly deputized the others on behalf of the federal government. To help in the legality of the arrest of John Price, Jennings had a power of attorney drawn up by an assistant clerk at the Mason County Courthouse in Kentucky. Jennings and his cronies were waiting that morning for a 13-year-old farmer's son named Shakespeare Boynton, or Shake for short. He would be driving a horse and buggy.
Shake Boynton was in the pay of Jennings. He coerced John Price into the buggy with the promise of work. Jennings sent his men to follow in a carriage.
John Price, I got legal power of attorney to take you in for being a runaway. You be peaceable now and nobody gets killed. You hear me, boy? Up you go now.
As Shakespeare Boynton drove back to Jennings to collect his $20, Price and his captors drove to the nearby town of Wellington. Jennings would come after, and they would hole up to await the arrival of an evening train that would take them and their prize to Columbus, and then on down from there to Cincinnati and across the Ohio River back to Kentucky.
But luck was not on the side of the slave catchers, because just then, walking along the road going back to town just as the carriage passed going the other way, was Oberlin student and violent abolitionist Ansel Lyman. Price yelled out he was being kidnapped. Lyman didn't let on that he'd heard. He just kept walking, buried in a book. But as soon as the wagon was out of sight, He sprinted into town, raised the alarm. Help! Slavers! Slavers! They got John Price! And get help he did. All of Oberlin was soon in an uproar. In just a little while, the whole posse of people, students, teachers, community members, white and black, would be galloping to Wellington to waylay the slave hunters.
South Main thronged with people at the alarm. Some of the first to run out armed were many of the free blacks of the town. Harness maker John Scott retrieved 3 rifles and borrowed a horse and buggy. John Copeland, who later would join John Brown in his attack at Harper's Ferry, was there, as was Lewis Leary, who would also fight and die with John Brown a year later. There were 3 escaped slaves who made their home in Oberlin, and a freeborn cabinet maker, the light-skinned Wilson Bruce Evans. Kansas lawyer Charles Langston grabbed a pistol and hurried to join them. He had been visiting his brother John. Both were Oberlin graduates and would later be important figures in American politics. Orondatus S.B. Wall, Charles's brother-in-law, a shoemaker by trade, left in a buggy with white bookshop clerk Simeon Bushnell. Bushnell's father-in-law, owner of the bookstore, James Fitch, and lawyer Ralph Plum had conferred with Bushnell and were on their way along with Oberlin theology professor Henry Peck, who had become one of the leaders of the rescuers. Other Oberlin faculty and students hurried to Wellington, including in their vast number John Watson, John Cowles, Jacob Shippard, James Patton, consumptive Scots-born William Scrimger, and, most momentously, 27-year-old theology student William Ellaby Lincoln, an English-born Oberlin Jr., Richard Windsor, who would be the most important player in the rescue. The town of Wellington, Ohio, was 9 miles south of Oberlin. It boasted 1,149 souls in 1858, not one of them black, compared to Oberlin, which had 420, with another 80 nearby, by far the highest percentage in Lorain County. Still, there were many in Wellington connected to the Underground Railroad, and Jennings and his partners were uneasy as they sat in the town's Wadsworth Hotel, awaiting the 5:13 p.m. train that would take them and their quarry south.
To make matters worse for the slave catchers, Wellington was crowded with people that morning. There'd been a terrific fire which had started in a harness shop on the public square and burned down a number of adjoining shops. Farmers came from miles around, drawn by the smoke billowing high in the air. Some townspeople and farmers crowded in to help put out the fire or just to watch. The ruins were still smoldering when John Price and his captors arrived.
At about 2 p.m., as the captors and their quarry were having dinner, there was a noise. Deputy Lowe jumped up from the table and looked out the door to the hotel's barroom. The crowd in the public square seemed to be making a commotion. He saw Oberlin's John Watson and another man, a black man, in a wagon. They had guns. The hotel keeper's wife rushed in and told the slave catchers that the front hallway was pretty full of people that seemed to be excited. She led the men and their prisoner to a second-room floor by a back stairway. Outside, the crowd seemed to be turning into an angry mob.
We don't know exactly how many there were. Accounts vary from eyewitness to eyewitness. But at least 200, and maybe as many as 500 people surrounded the hotel, shouting, "Bring him out! Bring him out!" It was rumored that federal law enforcement had wired for troops, and that the Cleveland Greys, state militia, were on their way on the 5:13 train to break up the mob. Arguments rang out. Wasn't he an arrested fugitive? A freeman? Did it matter? To most of those present, no, it didn't. It was slave catchers. Nobody had the right to come into our community and kidnap people. Damn the slave law. Damn President Buchanan. Damn the slave-owning interest that had a stranglehold on the U.S. government.
By this time, Wadsworth, the hotel keeper, had closed off the hotel and stationed people at the doors and stairways. The slaveholders moved up further to an attic on the 3rd floor with their captive. Oberlin student John Watson rushed to the town hall to get a warrant for the arrest of John Price's captors, and a clerk drew it up. The justice of the peace signed it and handed it to Wellington Constable Barnabas Meacham to serve.
When the constable arrived to serve a warrant, Jennings stopped him cold.
I am here with Federal Deputy Marshal Lowe, and we got a warrant for the arrest of this here fugitive slave.
Jennings led his captive, John Price, down to the second-floor balcony to address the crowd in hopes it would calm them down.
I want no controversy with the people of Ohio. This boy is mine by the laws of Kentucky and of the United States.
Price was questioned by people in the crowd. Did he really want to go back to Kentucky with those men? Price seemed scared. He said he supposed he had to. The slave catchers pulled John Price from the balcony, back into the room, and back up to the attic. Charles Griffin, an anti-slavery lecturer, had just arrived at the public square and heard what was happening. He paid someone to fetch a ladder that could reach up to the window on the third floor of the hotel. And he climbed it to the top, shouting through the window for John Price to fight off his captors and come down the ladder with him. But to no avail.
Oberlin student William Lincoln arrived finally at Public Square. His wagon on the way had broken a wheel, and he had had to stop to repair it. While all the negotiations and parleys went back and forth, he resolved to storm the building. Lincoln and his men stormed the front of the hotel, where guards had been placed to block entry. For 3 minutes they fought hand to hand. Heavy breathing, struggles, guns hurled here and there, men on the floor, as one account described it, until Lincoln raised his pistol and pointed it at one of the men guarding the entrance. Lincoln and his men rushed up the stairs, finally reaching the attic. Lincoln approached the door to the room that held John Price, but he could not wrest it open. By now the sun was setting outside, and the light in the hall was getting dimmer. Lincoln had thought to try to convince the slave catchers that there were more than 6 men in the corridor, but one of the black men dislodged some bricks from the wall, letting in more light, saying, "If I have to be killed, I want to die in the light." Lincoln's ruse was shattered, but another plan came to his mind, just as he noticed a pistol inches from his head, aimed through a high hole in the wall near the door where a stovepipe once ran. The hole had been papered over, but was now exposed.
Lincoln warned his men and, keeping out of range of the pistol, called on Sackett and one of the black men to follow him to the floor below. There was a guest room right under the attic room, and he ordered bedding, furniture, straw from mattresses piled up into a heap on the floor. He shouted up to Jennings that he meant to burn down the whole building if Price was not released.
Meanwhile, John Scott was leading another party intent on forcing their way in, including John Copeland, brothers Wilson Bruce and Henry Evans, and some others, with Charles Langston following behind them. With guns and other weapons, they launched an assault on the hotel from the rear, and very soon broke through the door.
Men pressed ahead, shouting and arguing and threatening to shoot. A slave catcher was pushed to the ground and nearly struck with a rifle, but another one grabbed the rifle away, smashed it against the wall, and threw the pieces out a dining room window into the street, and then went out to break it up some more. Wilson Bruce Evans struggled with the man. Scott came up and threw both men to the floor, clearing the path to the staircase, while Evans held onto the other man's long hair.
The 2 assault groups, led by Lincoln and Scott, converged in the hallway outside the attic room where John Price was being held.
In the room, Oberlin students Richard Windsor and James Patton had been trying to negotiate. Richard Windsor knelt down and in the waning light wrote a note on a piece of paper and shoved it under the door. It said to put a string around the latch of the door and pull hard, and the door will open. Lincoln read the note, but then he noticed a hole in the wall above near the door. He called through the wall that he would poke his gun through the hole and shoot. With that, he shoved his pistol into the hole in the wall, and Jennings looking through the hole, was struck by the pistol, knocking his hat off, and he fell down, letting go of the rope that was holding the door shut. Lincoln and the others pulled the door open with a jerk, thrust some weapons inside to keep the door from being closed. Then, with a great heave, they forced the door completely open. Just then, a window shattered as the top of the ladder struck it. More men were trying to come in. Windsor saw his chance and grabbed John Price. Had Price put his arms around his waist and, his back to Price, shielding him from view, backed out the door and into the hallway. Down the attic ladder, down the stairs, and to safety. John Price rushed out the door. Oberlin bookseller Simeon Bushnell had backed a buggy up to the hotel entrance. Windsor and John Price jumped in, and it sped off.
Back in Oberlin, John Price was eventually hidden in the home of Oberlin professor James Fairchild, and then he disappeared forever. Probably he was transported to Canada. The procession back to Oberlin that night was triumphant. Farmers and their families spilled out along the way to watch the parade, and the entire town of Oberlin seemed to turn out as the rescuers marched up Main Street. The celebration went on late into the night. Back in Wellington, the slave catchers were too concerned with their own safety to go after the fugitive, but they vowed revenge and they would get it. In the end, many of the rescuers would be prosecuted and serve time in jail. The fugitive slave law would only be repealed in the heat of the Civil War.
The Oberlin-Wellington Rescue paved the way for the Civil War and the abolition of slavery altogether. At the trial, rescuer Charles Langston gave a speech to the court and said it best for everybody, I think.
But I stand up here to say that if for doing what I did on that day at Wellington, I am to go to jail 6 months and pay a fine of $1,000 according to the fugitive slave law, and such is the protection the laws of this country afford me, I must take upon myself the responsibility of self-protection. And when I come to be claimed by some perjured wretch as his slave, I shall never be taken into slavery, so help me God. I stand here to say that I will do all I can for any man thus seized and held, though the inevitable penalty of 6 months imprisonment and $1,000 fine for each offense hangs over me. We have a common humanity. You would do so. Your manhood would require it. And no matter what the laws might be, you would honor yourself for doing it. Your friends would honor you for doing it. Your children to all generations would honor you for doing it. And every good and honest man would say you had done right.